Alright guys, this is our third unit on data and statistics. We are going to go over our first learning target, which is representing data on a scatter plot and then describing how variables are related. So we're going to take a look at some scatter plots. To start off, we're going to do some vocabulary. So if you want to pause the video and get down this vocab right now, then I will go through it. We're going to start with scatterplot. Scatterplots show a relationship between two variables measured each on its own axis. So again, like we had in linear relationships, we have the x and y axis. Again, there's a slight difference. Not all scatterplots have a dependent and independent variable. Now, each point on the data set represents one measure from each variable, and we don't connect the points in a scatterplot because it's not always a continuous movement. We will make lines through the scatterplots to make inferences and predictions as to what different points could be, but the points themselves aren't continuous. It's not like somebody walking away from a sensor because the time doesn't always go on, okay? And we'll get more into that. We'll also discuss positively associated scatterplots and negatively associated scatterplots. Two variables are said to be positively associated when one variable increases, the other variable also increases. So if we look, that might be a scatterplot that looks like this. Highs go with highs, lows go with lows. And then in the opposite way, a negative association is when highs goes with lows and lows go with highs. So then it looks to be negative. If you think about slope, it would have a negative slope, kind of tying that to our linear connections that we just had. So make sure you get all that down in your video notes. We're going to also talk about linear scatterplots versus nonlinear scatterplots. Because we're going to deal with scatterplots multiple points, when we say linear, we're saying like almost linear, having linear patterns, but not necessarily completely linear. Like you can tell these would not have a linear pattern. We'll see what this pattern looks like later in the year. This would also not be linear, although it's going in the same direction. Again, this would be positive, this would be negative. And then we can talk even more specifically about the positive and negative associations when we get into kind of weak and strong correlations. And we call this a correlation, is how are the variables related. This correlation is a big term. We'll also talk about causation later in the unit. But you can see this scatter plot has no relation. It's not going up, it's not really going down, it's just randomly everywhere. Okay, so let's talk about some positive correlations. A perfect positive would look like this. You can see if we connected those dots, it would be a line. So it's perfectly positive and linear. We call that a correlation of 1, very, very strong. In the opposite way, we'll look at a negative perfect correlation is -1. And then anything closer to 0 is no relation. Okay? This would be a strong positive relation. It's very close to a line. The data points are all close to what resembles a line. Then if you see a weak positive linear association or correlation, it's still going up. You can say, okay, highs go with highs, lows go with lows, but the data is more loosely associated with a line. All right. Then perfect negative, like I said, that's going to be a correlation of -1, and then we have a strong negative, a weak negative, and you can see as we get weaker, those correlations get closer to 0. All right, and then no correlation. Okay, when we have no correlation, our value is 0. Our correlation value is 0. Okay, so that's kind of the relation there. There are some scatter plots on your note sheet there. You can go ahead and label all those as positive, negative, or strong correlation and weak correlation or no correlation. We're going to move on. On the next page of your learning chart or your video notes, there's a spot for this scatter plot. I want to make this scatter plot in this video, and then we're going to fit a line to it in the next video. So we're going to just talk about kind of high quality graphs and and what you really need when you're looking at a scatter plot. When we were just dealing with linear equations, we didn't really care what our graphs looked like. We didn't talk about scales much other than the fact that they could count by more than one or less than one. So I really want to talk about when we have a high quality graph, we need labels, we need a title. If you're talking about a scatter plot and you're getting your data from a table, usually your title and your labels will be on the table. And it's not very difficult to have that or to find those, but they are important in a scatter plot because they tell you a lot about what you're looking at. Okay, so we're going to look at couples' ages. We're going to look at the ages of husbands compared to their wife's ages. And now, in linear relationships, we talked about independent and dependent variable. Here, it doesn't really matter. We can talk about the husband's age on the x-axis and the wife's age on the y-axis, or we can do vice versa, because one doesn't depend on the other. Okay, we're just going to look at, and we want to see how they relate. Are older men with older women? Are younger men with younger women? Is it the opposite? So we're going to look at some of those data points. Okay. One thing I do want to mention is that in a scatter point, you don't necessarily have to have this point be 0, 0. You can see here I'm starting with a point of 30, 30 because I see that my lowest point is 33. Okay, and I'm going from 33 to 76 is my highest. So I don't really need to start at 0, 0. If I were to start at 0, 0 here, then all of our data points would be way up in this corner. When you're making a scatter plot, you really just want to focus on how can I best see my data. So to create a window that fits with that. So I already kind of went through here and have a scale set up. So I go from 30 to 78, 30 to 78. And then I just put my husband's ages on the x-axis and the wife's ages on the y-axis. Again, it doesn't matter. We could have had the wife's age on the x-axis and the husband's on the y's. It doesn't matter. Now all we need to do is plot these points. So my first couple, and each row here represents a couple. The husband's age is 36 and the wife's age is 35. So I'm going to find husband's age 36. Wife's age would be 35 here. That would be about right there. And I'll just plot a point. Next, my husband's age is 72. Wife's age is 76. So 72 and 76 would be right about there. And I can just go through and plot all those points. So why don't you pause the video and make sure you have all those points plotted, excuse me. It looks like we have one little outlier here, and we'll talk about that. But I wanted to get some practice in just making scatter plots for this first video. So get that done, and then in class we'll talk about what does this mean, and what do we know about these couples after plotting these points. Okay. Before class, though, I'd like you to find a scatter plot online or in a newspaper or magazine. Print it out or email it to me. You can, if you don't have a printer, you can just take a screenshot or save it and email it to Megan Hansen at prairiepride.org. And what I'd like is for you to try not to just Google scatter plot, okay? Try to have the scatter plot that you find relate to something that you think is interesting. So maybe start with an interest of yours, and then Google that. Try to Google data on something that interests you so that we have some scatter plots that we can look at in class that actually mean something to 8th graders, and that will actually interest you and your peers, so we can talk about how these variables relate and what the data is actually talking to us about, because scatter plots are nice because in the real world you'll see them. You will find scatter plots online and in magazines, and you'll deal with these in the life that you have coming. So it's a nice way to talk about that and to relate it to interests. So go ahead and find one of those either online or in some kind of print. Again, if you need to, just take a picture of it, send it to me, and then we'll talk about those in class.